both. Now, this week, figures from the National Records of Scotland showed that the number of people who died due to drug misuse in Scotland last year fell for the first time in several years. However, Scotland continues to have one of the worst drug death rates in the world. The Scottish Government's proposing to decriminalise the possession of drugs, saying it would help and support people rather than criminalise and stigmatise them. But the UK Government, which controls drugs policy, has rejected the plan as dangerous. So should drug users be treated as criminals? Well, here to discuss this, our political commentator, Georgia Gilholy, and from the charity Turning Point Scotland, Jan Mayer. Welcome to both of you. Good morning.
Morning.
Now, Georgia, I think the idea behind this ultimately is to bring down the drug death rates. So the idea of decriminalisation, is that the right answer?
Unfortunately, I would say it's not. And I would say that because the tragedies we're seeing right now really are because the UK has been experiencing a sort of de facto decriminalisation for about the past 50 years. From the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, it's been actually very, very rare for people to be, sent to prison or prosecuted for personal possession of drugs. I would say that to stop people getting hooked in this cycle, what we need to do is have a strong legal disincentive against people getting into this cycle. That simply doesn't really exist in the UK, including Scotland, which is why we're seeing these tragedies. Lots of people who are pro-decriminalisation use examples from places in America, places like Portugal, and in those places we've actually seen that decriminalisation fails because what happens is police just ignore the problem, addiction soars, and what we'd see in the UK if we had decrim is big business controlling these substances more, and they would also see them be competing with the criminal gangs still, like what happens in Colorado and in California, because the criminal gangs can avoid tax. And since these substances are legalised in those places, the addiction goes up and more people die.
Well, I'm intrigued to see what Jan has to say about this. I mean, you've heard what Georgia's had to say, that decriminalisation does not work. What do you think in your experience?
I think there are types of decriminalisation that are less good and types that are better. There's not one way of doing this. And the approach that the Scottish Government set out is based on a lot of research that's been done around the world that says we don't want complete deregulation in the way that has just been suggested. What we're talking about is a highly regulated market that takes the drugs out of the criminal gangs' hands. So, for instance, in Scotland, in the NHS in Glasgow has been piloting a heroin-assisted treatment programme, which we could do a lot more of if we could stop the stigma of criminalisation and get more people into treatment.
Treatment is the key word there, Georgia. I mean, surely this is the idea behind this isn't seeing those who take drugs as criminals, but really as victims, that they should be helped throughout this. It's a process.
Of course, I sympathise with anyone who goes through these issues. I'd just like to say, first of all, it's actually impossible right now for the UK, including Scotland, which is still part of the UK, well, in some ways, it's actually impossible to totally decriminalise drugs because we're signed to international treaties that forbid us from doing so. So what's happened is the police simply don't enforce the law. That's what's happened. In terms of people being victims, I would say that people who are hooked on these dangerous substances are in fact victims of a legal system that ignores this issue, of a society that ignores this issue. If we decriminalise these substances, as I've said in other countries, it will soar, especially with it becoming more commercial. And as I've said, there's examples from California, Colorado, Amsterdam. The criminal gangs don't pay the tax, so they carry on with their business that makes them millions of pounds a year. Why would they not? And also think about the people who, especially in deprived communities, have to every single day walk past and deal with people who are dealing with drug abuse issues. They're more likely to commit violent crime and commit driving offences as well. Those have risen in connection with drugs.
So here's the problem, Jan. We've got an issue where we have got people who are breaking the law, no matter what way you look at it. So surely then there should be consequences.
Now, this absolutely presupposes that people who are having problems with their drug use are bad people. And I just don't buy that. We know in Scotland that you're 16 times more likely to die of a drug overdose if you come from a deprived area. We know that the majority of the people who use Turning Point Scotland services have experienced childhood trauma, childhood abuse. Many have been in the looked after system. These are not bad people. These are people who've been let down by society. And by criminalising their drug use, we stigmatise them as people, and that makes it harder for them to come and get treatment. And we know if we can get them into treatment, we can reduce their drug use and we can reduce their offending. Our stabilisation service last year, people who went through that service reduced their illicit drug use by 92%. They reduced their offending behaviour by 87%. We know that going to prison doesn't work. People come out and they carry on using drugs in prison, they carry on dying. They're actually more likely to die when released from prison as well, when they've had a period of abstinence and they go back to using.
What do you make of that then, Georgia? I mean, again, talking about these death rates here, the idea that if you do send people to prison, you're going to alienate them further. It could make the problem worse.
I disagree that wanting to have strong disincentives against these crimes, which hurt the people involved and hurt and profoundly traumatise the people around them. If you've ever dealt with, a family who's gone through a member of their family having drug abuse, it gravely wounds them, and you can never recover from that kind of thing. And I think that I don't want more people in prison and more people having, rubbish lives. I want more people to be disincentivised against this, and we can do better. You can have strong legal deterrents, as they do in South Korea and Japan, where addiction is much less of an issue, and you can also help people be rehabilitated. Totally agree with Jan that the prison system is not fit for purpose. You actually have prisons in the UK flooded with drugs, and no wonder people come out with less incentive to kind of have a better life for themselves.
Jan, so, I mean, the issue is we're having this discussion, Jan, and that's great, but the UK government has said that they will not decriminalise drugs. That's the bottom line. So what would you like to see? What other changes could they make to improve the situation, particularly in Scotland, where there clearly is an issue?
Yeah. I think there's things that the Scottish government could do, and I think we should give them credit for what they have been doing. We have had a 21% reduction in drug deaths, and that's because they've been following the evidence base about harm reduction-based treatment services. But we could do more. We need the Lord Advocate to find a way to allow us to have consumption rooms.
Jan, it's probably a bigger question than we've got time to answer here today, but to both Jan and to Georgia, thank you so much for your discussion today.